Ladies and gentlemen, Shadowlands Alpha has been rocking and rolling with a style we have not seen before. No other World of Warcraft expansion has been this clear, a great roadmap, wonderful feedback, and in fact, we are going live via satellite to Mr. Morgan Day from Blizzard in order to talk a little bit more about it. Welcome, Morgan!
Thanks for having me, man. Yeah, via my office, I guess, at home.
That is good enough for me. That is good enough for me. I'm super excited to talk to you because you are literally responsible for some of my favorite World of Warcraft encounters of all time.
Oh, thanks, man. That's good to hear.
It certainly is. Professor Putricide, that is awesome.
I got you.
I was looking back through a couple of your interviews. Do you look back fondly on Blackwater Behemoth out of interest? You're kind of hoping people would.
I think given what we set out to create, yeah, totally. I think, we talked about it originally as like, okay, we're making an underwater boss. As long as people don't look at it and say like, what were you thinking that was the worst thing? That's success. And I think it turned out to be really, really great. Keeping a lot of the Z elements of the encounter through the space where you're just kind of swimming between platforms, I thought was a really clever solution that the designer that worked on it came up with. And, yeah, I think it was pretty interesting.
Yeah, I was really impressed with a lot of what you said about the use of environment, because the art team does such a spectacular job, and we've seen that in Shadowlands, and how you tried to incorporate that.
Yeah, they always crush it. Those guys are amazing.
They certainly are. So you are responsible for so much in Shadowlands, more than I actually thought when I was originally told that maybe we could get an interview. I thought it was going to be all about dungeons, Torghast, raids, all the stuff I'm very interested in. And it was actually Josh who went, well, he also does all this stuff. And I was like, what?
Yeah. Well, we can talk about those things also if you want.
I would. I do want to very much. Yeah. I requested a 24-hour interview. Josh said no.
I might need a nap in there somewhere.
For sure. One of the things I'd really like to start off with is one of the most impressive things I've done so far in Shadowlands, which is Torghast. It's already a piece of content that I can see most of the player base leveling alts just to play Torghast. Like, was that an intention when you started it?
That was absolutely something that we discussed. I think the main goal with Torghast, like we've talked about, was just let's create a piece of content and, maybe even a game mode that we haven't seen in World of Warcraft before. And, that's one of the great parts about working on WoW is the possibilities are endless, and something that we're always inspired by is just games that we're playing ourselves. And, the roguelike genre has become a lot more popular recently, and we're all playing them ourselves. And, we were given the opportunity to say like, hey, what would be a fun, new game mode or feature? We had, islands or warfronts in Battle for Azeroth. So when we were talking about Shadowlands, this idea of Torghast came up because, from early inception, we knew the Jailer was going to be a big part of the expansion. And we had these amazing concepts of the tower. And we're like, I want to climb that. And what kind of game mode would work best for that? So, we really just have been focusing on making the most fun, exciting, replayable experience that we could. And, based on the feedback you guys have been giving, I think we're on the right track there.
Oh, absolutely. Like, I've logged in and played it so much off stream, not just for content creation purposes, just for fun.
Yeah, totally. I saw you were checking out the Druid because we just, recently came up with some of the Druid anima powers, and I saw you were checking them out today.
Yeah. Now, one of the hard things it's been, certainly from our point of view, while we're dealing with a lot of guys who want to know more and more about Shadowlands, is that as far as I'm aware, everything we're testing with Torghast is not what it's going to be on live. And we're trying to communicate exactly what that is. So what I was really hoping you could do is paint a picture of the live version of Torghast from like a casual player perspective, all the way to the guy who loves Torghast and wants to do it all day, every day. What is that going to look? Because we do know it is a mandatory piece of content.
So paint a picture, right? Like with pretty trees and
I would love that. If you want to whip paint out, I'm all for it.
I'll put on my wig. Right. So that's a great question, actually. And it's something that is still evolving, right? The question of depth versus breadth of engagement is a really interesting topic, and it's something that we've been talking about a lot, especially considering what you're discussing, which is just how much fun it is to just get in there and play it. So for your point about someone who is maybe doesn't play as often as someone like you might, One of the things with Torghast that we're really excited about is, this is a piece of content that scales from 1, so you can play it solo, all the way up to a full party of 5. We designed Horrific Visions actually with Torghast in mind in that regard. We really wanted to experiment with this idea of this, piece of content that worked as a solo experience or with a full party or anywhere in between as well. And one of the things that we learned early on from Horrific Visions was just kind of the tuning, what was and wasn't working there, but also we have been discussing the rate of engagement, how much you can actually play with Torghast. And initially we weren't actually planning to come out with a mode or a version of it where you could just kind of play it for 8 hours a day straight, like you said, you've been engaging with it. But based on community feedback, based on stuff that you have expressed yourself, we want to revisit that. We definitely think there's a ton of cool opportunity there to come up with something where for someone who wants to play it as much as possible, they can engage with it without, like one of the keys that you need for Horrific Vision or a key that you would need for a run that might provide you with, your currency to build your legendary. And we think there's a ton of opportunity there. It will likely, we haven't fleshed out the details, but one of the things that we've been discussing is it would likely turn into something that looks more like a mage tower, where it's more for prestige and the rewards are cosmetic. We would keep that mode separate from the mode that would require a key to come into.
That's really cool.
And as we've talked about, access to Torghast, we want to feel like a function of how much WoW you're playing, and for the runs that might be, finish this floor or finish this wing of Torghast, and you can get your currency for your legendary crafting. We want the access and the amount that you do that to be a function of how much you're playing. It's not too dissimilar from what you're seeing with Horrific Visions, where you kind of get one a week for free, and then as you engage more in certain other types of content, you're provided with more keys to do more runs. So we've learned a lot there. And that's kind of the what we're thinking about right now.
No, I like that. So there's like going to be almost a mode which is, this is where you get your legendary stuff. This is, the kind of thing you need to do, or you'll want to do on your reset, or at least once a week. Mm-hmm. But also, if we want to push for cosmetic things, we can literally set aside a day. We don't have to worry about farming keys. We don't have to worry about getting prepared. With like Horrific Visions, everybody needs to have access, otherwise you can't do it. So now we can say, come on, whichever character you want, and we're going to just go for a long run, which I know in Tali's interview, it was mentioned that maybe, the expected mandatory time would be about 30 minutes, which I guess would be about floor 12 based on what we've seen now. Whereas in this longer version, you can stay in there until you get overwhelmed, I suppose.
Like I said, we haven't completely nailed out the details there. I don't know that it would be quote unquote endless. Mm-hmm. We're still trying to figure that aspect out. Like you mentioned also in terms of it feeling or being a required mode, I think, we've talked about this being the place where you're going to get your legendary. So if you're a person who, maybe you're looking at Horrific Visions as like, do I have to do this as much as I do Horrific Visions? With Torghast, legendaries are going to be unique equip 1. So if you're someone who, wants to do a couple runs and then get your legendary, and you can have the one legendary that's like, this is the one I wanted, cool, I can be done with this. But at the same time, the goal is just to make it as fun as possible, and we want everyone to enjoy doing the content. I've been talking a bit about Horrific Visions, but it's weird to say, but I think Torghast actually feels more like traditional WoW gameplay, even though it is very inspired by a roguelike. In Horrific Visions, it's very Lovecraftian, right? There's that like ever-present like sanity drain, and it almost, if you played any like Eldritch board games, it's like I'm losing. Oh, sweet, I won, thank God, right? It's a very different feeling than what Torghast currently feels like. So, the main goal is just to make it as fun as possible for everyone.
Yeah, so far doing a great job, and it's again, it's a mode I absolutely love. Moving on to it though, a lot of the powers we are seeing, like you said, you've added some mage ones, added some druid ones. They are class wide, which is having sort of a pro and a negative, instead of we're not seeing as many spec specific ones. So in certain cases, certainly with the druid, which has 4 different roles, is a lot of them revolve around, say, Moonfire, and we're not seeing any crazy bear things. We have seen Growl being a DPS cooldown, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
Are we going to see more of that? Is that something that's
Right.
ongoing development, or are we expected to see it be more class-based and covenant-based?
Right. So like you mentioned, actually the Grau one is a great example. We can run with that. But one of the main core goals of Shadowlands and some of the philosophies Brian has talked about was bringing class fantasy back. We really wanted to try to keep the focus on the class itself. There's a lot of reasons for that, but to your point of like having these anima powers feeling distinct and unique per spec, I think even with them being class wide, the Growl one is a great example where even though Growl is class wide, as a Guardian Druid, you're going to look at that power and get really excited to see that. And I think there's also plenty of opportunities for any Druid spec to see that and be like, oh, okay, maybe I'll take that in this run. And you might prioritize that differently based on your spec that you're currently playing, but that's a broad suite of powers that you can kind of choose from. And the variance comes from run to run, maybe based on what your composition is or what your own personal role is. So, we think we can fulfill the same goals with making spec ones, but by keeping them class wide, that one being a great example.
Okay. The last thing I kind of wanted to mention on Torghast as it's ongoing is, will you, because Torghast is such a self-enclosed environment, right? It's in its own little bubble. Will you use this to test potential things for future outdoor content, world content, raid content? Is this a good place to actually utilize this place as a test ground for those and see how the population as a whole deals with them?
That's a really interesting idea. I hadn't actually considered that. You're basically pitching like, what if we did class design brawls or whatever, right? Like,
oh yeah, it's like,
that's kind of cool.
What if we, you might come up with an idea and say, I don't think people are really going to like that. You could throw it into Torghast as a flaw, and it's people fail it. Okay, it's not worked out, or people give negative feedback just within Torghast. It's very much easier to remove that than say a boss encounter, right? So
yeah, totally. It's like a quite the sandbox where we can kind of experiment. And I mean, thinking about this now, like Overwatch is doing something similar with experimental modes right now. So that's a really cool idea and definitely something we could discuss. But, actually come to think of it, with that said, we are looking at some of the anima powers that we're creating in there to leverage as potential legendary powers that you can craft through running Torghast. And, this is, like you said, one of the main places where we can kind of take the gloves off and there's no rules about balance. So we do need to kind of keep that in mind. You might not get it one for one, but actually, are there any powers that like you have seen that you're like, oh my God, can I have a legendary of that, please? That won't break the game?
I've got to be honest, one of the greatest things about Torghast is when you break the game. That's like the really fun part. But Invis being a DPS cooldown is really fun, setting up for that. Because it's on such a longer cooldown, so you really can't, you maybe get it once or twice per fight. I don't think that would break the game either, because you can't really utilize any other spells within invisibility. You have to fire off that fireball, or you can't pair it up perfectly. I'm sure some scammers
it's like one big alpha strike.
Yeah, exactly. It's like you're going into a mega combustion or something along those lines. But if you can make
PvP also, I'm sure, or battlegrounds.
I mean, no one plays PvP, you know that. If we could get, say, Guardian Elemental to have permanent Earthquake, that would be pretty fun.
Very cool.
Yeah, that would be very cool.
Nice. All right, I'll pass that along if the combat guys aren't already listening.
Let's move on to dungeons just for a minute, because obviously you have fingers in so many pies. From the couple of dungeons that we've looked at, it looks like you've actively moved to reduce the length of the dungeons from what we've seen in BFA, which have some very, very long dungeons in there. Now, we have only seen 2 of them, so it might just be a coincidence that's popped out. I mean, we were just wondering, is that something you've actively tried to do, is to make them a little bit shorter and more even in length, or will we see bigger dungeons later, etc.?
That's an interesting observation. So I wouldn't say that was a goal. I think maybe what you're seeing right now is the product of a couple things. Potentially, for one, it's important to remember that these are level up dungeons. A lot of the, if you think back to BFA and Legion, a lot of the level up dungeons did tend to be a little bit on the faster side than say like, an Arcway or some of our, max level dungeons like Siege of Paralis. So that is a product of these being level up dungeons. That is part of the goal. It also might just be a tuning thing right now. We're still early in the alpha. Just baseline combat tuning may be a little bit off, and maybe just, a standard dungeon trash pack isn't taking as long to kill as we might have expected it to. So That's not necessarily an intentional thing you're seeing. I am curious to get your take on that though. Like how have they felt? Like have you guys enjoyed the length of the dungeons? Are they a little bit too quick for
I'm
your
not sure
taste?
I'm
Or
representative. No, they're not too quick for my taste. I have fun, and I don't feel like I'm doing really long stretches of just trash and things. The pacing seems to be really good. So both of them so far have actually followed quite a similar formula, which has been the end bosses are really back to back, which I enjoy because you have to decide then when are you using that bloodlust. Are you going to use longer cooldowns on one of them because you're not going to have it for the next boss, or at least till later on. But so far, the length has felt really nice. I haven't done,
right.
and there is only two, but I haven't felt any as dragged on.
Right, and this is funny because actually the next dungeon, Miss Tyrannosaurus, is going to be a 3-boss dungeon. It's our only 3-boss dungeon, so that one may be a little bit on the quick side as well. But there is a really cool. I'm excited for people to get their hands on it. There's a really neat, unique trash section where there's actually a bit of a trickster boss, and he's kind of messing with you, and he's built this this like misty maze that you have to solve puzzles to get your way to the boss, and then you use that mechanic on the boss. But the main goal with our dungeons is always to provide as much variety as possible. Where some people really do like the those 5-boss dungeons that are a little bit longer, and we totally have a max level dungeon this expansion that is 5 bosses. I forget the name of it off the top of my head. You could probably open the DJ and check it out, but
yeah.
That is the goal, right? Is to just make sure there's variety there, and we don't have too much variance in terms of the time it takes. We always have that. You should be able to run through a dungeon on your a queued dungeon experience on your lunch break, and making sure that we don't get too far out of that band is important.
Well, one thing that's been pretty clear is how creative you've been with the dungeon boss mechanics. Even just looking at the necrotic wake, we've got you're being teleported, and we've got a gauntlet in there. We have obviously Surgeon Stitchless, I think his name is, with the harpoon mechanic, which is definitely catching a lot of people out and managing the ads on the first boss as well. So it's nice to see that the dungeons aren't sticking. I haven't seen anything that's been kind of like, okay, this boss doesn't do anything, which is always totally great to see in dungeons.
And Theater of Pain is the name of the max level 5 boss dungeon. Thanks, chat.
That is an edgy name.
I know, right?
Theater of Pain.
I mean, we joke about it, but like Maldraxxus, every time we talk about that zone, we're like, this zone is so metal. Everything about this zone is just metal. So I mean, when we're going to even the names of it, when we go to name it, we're like, okay, is this metal enough? I sure hope so.
Well, I hope one of the bosses literally has a guitar that he's beating you with. That would be perfect. If we could get that going. There's an entire council boss that's a band. He's banging you with his drums.
We have that in the Dark Moon Fair.
Yeah, I guess we would have seen a hardcore
maybe version. Make that special appearance.
Yeah, for sure. I just thought the last note really on dungeons, because we've only got 2, I don't want to spend too much time on them, that we saw in BFA, because we carried over a lot of the Mythic Plus affixes from Legion, is that some of the dungeons didn't play particularly nicely with them. You got like Waycrest with Sanguine. It was kind of messy for your average group. Is that something you guys have taken more care of this time, or is it just sometimes that's the way it's going to be for the sake of creating a good, interesting dungeon?
Interesting. Right. So do you have other examples there? I'm curious to hear. Like, obviously, yeah. As soon as you were talking about this question, I was like, yeah, Sanguine in Waycrest Manor can get pretty rowdy. But were there other examples that you felt?
Yeah, certainly when you're dealing with Bolster, there are a lot more packs that seemingly have an extremely high health enemy and then surrounded by very low health enemies. That happens quite frequently in certain dungeons. What we see often in live, and certainly at this release of a new season, is that some people will say, a 15 of this dungeon is harder than doing like an 18 of another because of the affixes, and people start getting a little bit, they look at getting their key that week and go, well, that's a dead key because of maybe how the affixes work within that dungeon.
Yeah, I mean, we want to try to avoid experiences like that, right? Like we want there to be texture from week to week with the affixes, including how those affixes interact with each dungeon, right? So like if Waycrest Manor is a little bit harder this week than it was last week, we think that's actually really valuable for the system as a whole, and maybe we'll change the decisions that you make in terms of what dungeon we want to run. I think we run into problems when there's too large of a delta there. Like you said, like if I can't do a key that's 4 lower than I did the previous week because of a specific dungeon or affix problem, yeah, that's something that we should look to address. Our goal always with Mythic Pluses, or Mythic Plus affixes rather, is to add variety, to make sure that they are evergreen and that they work in each dungeon and feel differently through each dungeon. And we always have we always have some rough edges, but we try to nail those out and get those resolved as quickly as possible. I'm sure everyone remembers, God, what was it? The Blackrook Hold Gauntlet with Necrotic.
Yeah, yeah, I do.
That was challenging. We had a chance to fix that. I think something that I can say we know we can improve on and do better is with Battle for Azeroth, we were introducing the idea of seasonal affixes. And we actually held the Mythic Plus system as a whole back until we had that seasonal affix online, Infested. That was what it's called, right? Infested? Yeah,
Yep.
Infested. And I think, I think with Shadowlands, that's one of the takeaways is if we don't have our seasonal affix ready, we can totally still enable Mythic Plus. Once the max level loop is turned on, once a lot of those max level activities turn on, we can also turn on Mythic Plus, even if we don't have all the new affixes ready, just because of things like you said. It'll be good to find those, kind of rough edges with some of the dungeon affix combinations if those pop up.
Oh, excellent. Now, and this is very early in this process, but I do have to bring up raiding, and certainly having you here. Castle Nathria is the raid we're going to be getting. 10 bosses to kick us off. Like I brought up at the beginning, in your interview you did on Tomb of Sargeras, you talked about using the environments that the guys create in order to try and work it into the mechanics of the fights.
Absolutely.
And you used Maiden, actually, as the example, using the hole in the middle as becoming part of the fight, which was really, really good. So I'm wondering, for Castle Nathria, we've got DDR bosses in there. We know that a certain old face has yet again managed to make his way back into another setback. Another setback. And the big beefy chested Denathrius, I think is his name, is going to be making an appearance. But have you been able to do that in Castle Nathria? Anything you could tease us on maybe something interesting happening there? Or are we going to see Queen Ashara hiding behind pillars, which maybe didn't quite work as well?
There are actually quite a few examples where we're trying to incorporate the environment. I think philosophically, I'm obviously a huge fan. I often would do that myself. But philosophically, we really just want to do that where it makes sense and where the environment lends itself to that. If we did that on literally every encounter, it wouldn't be unique and special anymore, or just kind of become the norm. But I should have asked before. That's fine. Spoilers. For the Denathrius encounter, like you mentioned, if you look, I think the DJ is kind of work in progress right now, but there's an ability during the intermission where it mentions falling to a new floor. So that will be an encounter where the environment very much is a big part of the encounter, and it is also a multiple floor fight, similar to what you might have seen
Mr. Blackhand?
Blackhand's an example. Avatar of Sargeras is another example. We don't often get the opportunity to do that. We usually want to make sure that it makes sense for the encounter and it'll fit. But this felt like the right time for that. So absolutely, yeah, that's something that we always look to try to incorporate where we can.
Oh, super. Well, thank you very much for that.
Matt, don't get mad at me. Sorry.
Nobody heard. It's fine. I won't tell anyone. In other interviews, again, it was been really interesting to me looking back on things you've said. It was very clear to me that when you come to design a raid encounter or a dungeon, is that you look heavily into the lore for the inspiration as to why bosses are there, what the environment should be like. And Shadowlands is such a clean slate. From the past of World of Warcraft. Has that been tricky for you, or has it actually been freeing to say, oh, okay, I could really go a little bit wild with this?
Interesting. Yeah, I wouldn't call it a completely clean slate, right? Like, while we do see a lot of new things in the Shadowlands, a lot of what we're seeing is also shares a similar family or ecologies to things that might look very familiar from Azeroth, right? So, for instance, in Ardenweald, there are the Sylvar, which are creatures that are, that you will see in Ardenweald, but they also very closely resemble the Dryads that we've seen on Azeroth. And, that isn't a coincidence. That's something that we think a lot about in terms of where are we taking our inspiration from. And that also just allows us to use that as a familiar fantasy, not only for the player, but also for ourselves, right? You have a sense of what a Dryad does on Azeroth. So it's very likely that the Sylvar do things that are at least in the same ballpark as those guys. Yeah.
Okay.
The community also is really cool, really, really good at catching those links, right? Like, There's been some theory crafting on our boy Denathrius even about what his origins are and some of his backstory, and it's really really fun to kind of see the community speculate about that kind of thing.
I can't tell
Also,
you
just
how.
even small speculation. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying, I can't tell you how excited I was during Revendreth's story to figure out who the persecutor was. I forget the exact title that she has. We were all guessing who could this character be as we moved through it, and it turned out to be somebody we didn't know. I think she was called Grace, who murdered her daughter or something along those. Spoilers, sorry. But all the way through that, we had thousands of people going, "I'm pretty sure it's her." Like I know the lore, I know where she's coming from. But we will see more of that with revealing who the past of these characters and all those kinds of things.
Sorry, with the raid, you mean, or
just in general in the game? Are we going to be encountering more open world characters, raid characters, dungeon characters? You actually reveal, because we have seen Bluther, we do know that he's there, but characters who maybe have been transformed and they were actually somebody that we may have seen in the past.
Yeah, I mean, like you mentioned, or actually, this question is kind of all about is, while Shadowlands is very new in terms of a lot of the things and the story that we're exploring there, it is also one of the many many afterlives of Azeroth, and we're going to see existing characters. We're going to get to revisit some stories that we maybe didn't feel like we had closure on, and Bluther is a good example there.
I did not choose that name.
Yeah, I don't.
It's not me.
We're just accepting it.
It's happened. It's nothing we could do now. It's over.
Steve's so mad at me right now. But yeah, there is also more characters to come that we're gonna have a chance to meet in the Shadowlands.
I would be remiss not to ask you this while I've got you. Is one of the highlight of my year every couple of times is the World First race, and I did talk to a couple of your guys at BlizzCon. Is Mythic only phases? I don't know how to bring it to N'Zoth, but they did express that because so many hundreds of thousands of people now get to vicariously experience those things at the exact same time as these guys, that maybe you're more open to some slightly more extravagant Mythic only phases, certainly for the last bosses. Is that something that's a thing or not really worthwhile?
Interesting question. Do you not, okay, of our previous Mythic only phases, are there some that you would have considered extravagant, or do you not think we've hit the bar that you're really thinking about?
No, not all. Sinestra was an amazing experience. To have that floor collapse and fall down into Sinestra's room and have that. Illidan, of course, at Gul'dan, was an absolutely fantastic experience. It was one of the reasons I pushed to I was kind of 50-50 on going hard at that time, and then found out that there was going to be this extra thing, and Illidan was going to show up, and I was very much into it. Having Cho'Gall, it's selfish for sure, but I can only imagine casting the World First race and then seeing Cho'Gall come running through that door. Right?
What is
you imagine, you can imagine the resonating throughout the community of having that moment. Like, you would, all eyes would be on that, even though, realistically not many players will get to experience it.
Yeah, so, sorry, I was just trying to make sure I was going to answer your question correctly, so I was asking, kind of the follow-up. But, I personally think Mythic only phases are really, really cool, especially when we have that cool story hook. Like, the Cho'Gall example you just used was a perfect example, and it really, when we sat down to discuss, like, okay, cool, well, what's the Mythic for this fight? It just kind of made sense. It didn't feel forced. You just completely, everything clicked, oh, of course Cho'Gall is here, right? So that's usually the goal when we talk about the Mythic phases, or Mythic end bosses, and what are they going to do, is often the fantasy and the story helps inspire that, and we don't want to make them feel like well, we have to do a Mythic only phase, because then it's not exciting, and it's not when you see it happen live on stream, like you said, it isn't a surprise at that point. You're just like, okay, well, what are they doing this time? So we usually try to make sure that when we do pull that card, I guess, that it feels appropriate and exciting when you see it.
No, I think that's fair.
And yeah,
you definitely don't want it to be like a standard. And the Mythic only phase this time is X. What you want is that, again, like the Cho'Gall moment. You want to not know it's going to happen, and it makes sense and it's appropriate. Not just trying to squeeze, because the quality would go down if you're just squeezing it in all the time. But you're still open to it, though.
Oh, absolutely. I think, I wouldn't say that we have ever said no more of that, right? It's more just a factor of where does it make sense? What is it?
Okay. So we need to move on to Covenant abilities.
Sure.
Okay, because this is obviously a hot topic, especially amongst the circles I travel in, and also a hot topic actually amongst the entire community. And when Ian spoke to Ted, my baldy brother, he did mention that the conversation about tying the abilities as part of your Covenant choice was internally being discussed still. There was back and forth there. We've obviously got to try out at least 2 of them for each spec now. And we are seeing the divide we expected to see, where some feel clearly superior to others. I'm just wondering, can you update us on where that conversation is now, and how you guys feel now testing's been done?
Totally. So I think, first and foremost, we really appreciate all the feedback that the community is giving us. This is something that, even as we discuss internally, and when we were talking about like, okay, so what's our next steps here? How do we want to approach this problem? One of the first things that we identified was, well, we just need to get everyone involved. We need to reach out to, guys like you and our community, and making sure that we've got, proper channels of feedback opened up, and that we can kind of discuss and identify some of the potential problems that you guys are talking about, and make sure that we ourselves feel like we have enough knobs to kind of tune it and make sure it doesn't feel like you're going to have a covenant that just feels like they're not as good as someone else here or there. So the thing that I think is still important to talk about is that we're not done making stuff yet, right? Like with these covenant abilities, that's only part of the equation. We still have things that are yet to be seen and yet to be played by the community, such as our soul binds are still coming online, conduits are still being worked on, legendary powers are still being worked on. So we still want to make sure that we get all of those pieces into the community's hands, as quickly as possible. One of the things that we really learned from Battle for Azeroth that I believe Ian has talked about is just the earlier we can get things into your hands as a community, the more feedback we can get, the more time we leave ourselves for iteration. So we're still trying to get all that stuff online. The team is actively working on that stuff. And one of the things we've also identified is that conduits would be a great tuning knob to kind of provide certain class/covenant characters, unique benefits or bonuses. So like if, for instance, if you've identified, hey, this, the Kyrian Warlock feels very single target and I'm going to be lacking in AoE damage, we can create a conduit that will be specific to Kyrian Warlock that will make their AoE damage better in different ways. And that would be unique to them. Another thing is just being open to, the possibility of redesign or, tweaking or completely redesigning Covenant abilities when you guys have identified, okay, there's just way too big of a gap here. There's no way this ability with these soulbinds and conduits, is in the ballpark of these other ones over here. We're already making changes on that. Ashen Hollows, which is the paladin Venthyr ability, is right. It's already something that we've looked at and have already made adjustments to that ability based on that feedback.
Yeah.
So that's just examples of things that we're still doing.
Okay.
And like I said, there's still a lot of new stuff coming online. And we just want to get that in everyone's hands with enough time to make sure that we can also iterate and potentially add new things if necessary.
Yeah, for sure. Like a lot of the conversations we've had away from maybe the public eye discussing this, with a lot of people who are very contentious about the issue, is that we will wait till we get that more complete picture before, because like, with some things, certainly I know I've personally been very outspoken about certain things. I was like, this is not going to work, as far as I feel. And it's not that time yet until we do get this full package. So I'm wondering if you could, again, paint as a picture, if you could get paint out again. On day one, Castle Nathria releasing, assuming you stagger the release like you have done with every expansion launch in recent memory, what is our character going to look like? Is this a character that will have maybe a Covenant ability, a completed conduit perhaps, and a legendary item? Or what will that character look like and be geared as on day one? Of actual doing that, that season's content.
So, like we've mentioned, at max level, you get to choose the covenant that you want to join based on your level of experience. You'll have had an opportunity to play with the signature ability and the covenant ability, and then at max level, you're asked to make a choice. And who do you want to join? At that point, you'll be granted those abilities permanently, and you'll be able to soulbind yourself with one of 3 soulbinds. And as you gain favor and renown with your covenant, you'll unlock further tiers of that soulbind. And I mentioned it's not in the alpha yet, but I'm pretty sure people have pieced together what those soulbinds look like based on data mining and things like that.
So those are accurate. Sorry to interject. I'm just it was a big conversation we've had.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, I'd have to look at all of them, but that is the idea that is behind soulbinds, and those things. It's very impressive, the community tools and what people can put together. But for the most part, yeah, those are pretty spot on. Like I said, those are all still very work in progress. None of those are on alpha yet. Actually, speaking of which, to finish your question. And yes, Paul Cubitt mentioned that Torghast will be available basically as soon as our max level activities open up. So the expectation is hopefully you'll be able to have a legendary as you go into Castle Nathria as well. Actually, something I forgot to mention as we're talking about just what our next steps were, and in terms of getting feedback from you guys, something that I think tomorrow even we want tomorrow starting tomorrow with Torghast, when you enter it, they'll actually have all of the covenant abilities available, even if the zone isn't active. To the best of my knowledge, I think the way that that's being rolled out is just basically daily. It'll say like, okay, today it's Kyrian, so anytime that you do Torghast, you'll have the Kyrian ability unlocked. Or the next day it'll be Maldraxxus. So even though Maldraxxus isn't available right now, we want to get those abilities out in front of players, get your feedback, get your thoughts, so that we can start that conversation, even though the zone might not be available to play.
So you're saying in the next few days we will have every covenant available over the next few days to test and play around with, including Ardent Wields and Maldraxxus.
I think there may be a couple holes here or there. I can follow up with you afterwards, and I can poke a couple people. There still might be a few that are still not quite done and ready for testing, but currently we had been holding the covenant abilities until the zone opened up, but a lot of those are ready. So this week, all the covenant abilities that are ready, when you go into Torghast, it'll daily kind of roll over. We call it a world state. So as the world state rolls over every day, it'll flip between Venthyr today, Ardenweald tomorrow, Bastion the next day. So then hopefully the next time the alpha is updated, that will be in the next build.
That is really exciting, and it's been. I know this is slightly off topic, but compared to what we've done, I mean, I've alpha tested and beta tested WoW now since Mists of Pandaria. I think was the first time. Well, actually, the Burning Crusade, but I didn't do it actively. The roadmap you guys have is so much better. Like that, it's almost like a completely different company this time around. Like we know, as it is right now, that on a Wednesday evening, at least for me, there's going to be an update. And what steps did you guys take this time around to make it very unlike BFA, where we had almost no communication? We've already had so much feedback. We've got this interview, as well as many others that have taken place. How much of a priority was that to say, this time we're doing it like this? And how far ahead are you guys planned with rolling out of content?
Well, first of all, thank you. I appreciate it.
I'm amazed. I'm utterly amazed. That's not blowing smoke up your bum or anything.
Sure. But yeah, I mean, thank you very much, first of all. But yeah, like, we've said a couple times, that is by far the most valuable lesson we kind of took as a team from Battle for Azeroth. Was it's just really valuable to get eyes on this stuff, even if we're not really 100% on the design of a thing. It's still valuable to get it out in front of you guys and just kind of get that feedback as early as possible. And part of that was just coming up with the roadmap, like you said. Like to your point, yes, we do have essentially the roadmap of, cool, here's this piece of content, it's going to come out on this alpha build, and here's where we're going to try to transition into beta. And we try really hard to hit those goals so that you guys have new things that kind of keep you coming back to the alpha and excited to look at. And that's been a goal, and it's glad to hear that it's working for you guys.
It's been night and day. So impressed.
I got a message. I'll pass it along. Paladin and Rogue won't be available in that update that I was talking about.
Okay.
So the Covenant class won't be there either. Maldraxxus, Demon Hunter, Paladin, Night Fae are also not going to be there, but that's the only stuff that, like I said, we're actively still working on these things. It's an alpha.
Well, that still leaves so much to do.
We mean that. Exactly. So that's still a lot more than you've seen previously.
Yeah, that is sure. I want to mix in your encounter design and, of course, your Covenant knowledge now. There is potential for some of these Covenant abilities to bring enormous levels of utility. And I'm not talking about the actual Covenant abilities, but more the Covenant-wide abilities. So, Night Fae Blink, Venthyr Teleport.
The signature ability.
Yeah, the signature ability. How does that affect how you're designing some fights? Because obviously if we take a fight like N'Zoth, if, say, DKs were able to teleport, during fights like that, and the amount of wipes that would have reduced having to deal with that fight is almost trivialized in a way. So is that something you're actively thinking about now when designing fights? Is like, well, if people, and also we do run the risk, although it affects so few people, I understand that, of people actively having to have 4 characters to access this, because it makes the fights so much easier. Like, I can only imagine how many fewer wipes we would have had at N'Zoth if, say, our DK was any good, 1, and 2, he could have...
Shots fired.
It's true. And the ability to teleport out of some of those dangerous scenarios.
Yeah, that's actually a fantastic question, and something that I can't understate how often we talk about, both as an encounter group and the combat or class group. I'm going to take it up a level here, just kind of high level philosophy, and explain
that's the stuff I love.
Our approach. Yeah, and I can just kind of explain what our approach to this is, because you're right, this is a very real problem, and it can cause balance concerns. It can cause lots of issues. So the simplest way I can think about it, and that we discuss it internally, is as a class designer, as a combat designer, it's our job to make unique and interesting tools that an individual class has, right? Like we talk about these strengths and weaknesses. We talk about like solving these problems, and it's our job as class designers to make cool stuff that the player then feels like they have at their disposal. And on the flip side of that, as an encounter designer, it's up to us to make interesting puzzles that the player can then use that toolkit to solve, right? So it's very much a collaborative effort where it's like, cool, what does the class have to work with right now that I can create an interesting encounter or design that they can feel really smart in using those tools to help defeat this encounter. So that's kind of like high level how we think about that. Like, you give me the tools and then I make the cool puzzle.
Yep.
Where we run into problems with this, like you're talking about N'Zoth, for example, I think that's that's kind of a perfect storm of several things, and speaks to just mages being really strong in that encounter, for one. But it also, where we run into problems is when we don't create enough variety in the puzzles within an encounter. Actually, funny enough, here, I'm going to share a story that no one's heard before.
Oh, please do.
Because it was before the days of streaming the World First Race. Okay. So, when I talk about this with the different groups, an example I often use is Heroic Ragnaros. So Heroic Ragnaros progression, I got to watch it because I was, just kind of spying, but it wasn't streamed. So, but how that kind of played out was, in phase 2, there were these molten elementals.
Yep.
And the way people were dealing with it was they were just kind of balling up in a corner, and they were trying to burst them down as quickly as possible. So the raid was really, really heavily stacked with balanced druids and frost DKs and people that had really strong AoE burst damage. They then got past that part of the fight, and they moved on to the next phase, where there was a completely different puzzle that required different tools to solve. So when they got there, they realized, crap, we can't actually get past phase 3 with this comp. So now we need to kind of switch our comp around a little bit to progress past that part of the fight. So, it ended up with a lot of class stacking to solve specific problems, because, if the combat designers, one of their main goals is creating clear strengths and weaknesses for classes. So if we're doing a good job there, and you're presented with a problem that there's a class that's really good at solving that problem, if you stack it, it's going to be easier, right? Like, that's just how this works. But then the challenge is just making sure we're testing enough different things within an encounter so that by the end of the encounter, you end up with a fairly, balanced looking composition, even though along the way there was probably some class stacking to get past a few hurdles.
Yeah. No, that's entirely true. I think I did that progress myself. I was one of those Frost DKs, and by the time it got to the stage of balancing that comp, you're absolutely right. Even those classes had to push harder then and let others take the lead a little bit while you drop back into doing your standard stuff. And also the amount of utility there in the classes. I mean, Heroic Ragnaros is considered one of the greater fights, I think, because of that. Is that you had grips, typhoons, all those elements came in at some point in that fight to make a balanced comp and really showed off the strength of the individual classes. And again, it does kind of bring up, and we could maybe circle around to this as we talk about the classes in a moment, is that utility aspect, which is, we could talk about the good side on fights like that, but there's also the side where, those classes that lack that kind of immunity, that kind of utility, certainly widespread utility, have been kind of seasonally benched. But I'd like to come back to that in a moment, if possible.
Sure, yeah.
But that's a very cool way of thinking about it. I like that.
Yeah. So I mean, like I said, that's kind of high level, but I mean, the TLDR there is, as an encounter designer, those things that you're mentioning, like the Ventir teleport, that's just a tool in that person's tool belt. And now that I know that that exists, I can start to design cool things. I think even there might be opportunities, I think in the Denathrius encounter that we've talked about a couple times, where if you're Ventir, that teleport might come in handy.
You're upsetting the mages though, because it can cross gaps. I'm just letting you know. The mages are a little mad that it's better than their blink. I'm just letting you know.
Blink. You don't like the twig on the ground? Like,
I like it. It's fine for me. Yeah, I'm just keep an eye on those mages. Just finishing up on the Covenant abilities then, as we are waiting for kind of the whole picture. So when the class has multi-role, so your druids that are tanks, healers, ranged DPS, and melee, and your shamans, which are the same, the ranged melee and a healer, it looks like you're having to create Covenant abilities that work for both healing and DPS. So if we look at Vesper Totem, for example, it's a healing DPS hybrid. How is this making it harder to create and balance those abilities compared to, say, Warlocks and Rogues, which all three of them have a DPS-centric Covenant ability for the most part?
Right. That's a great question. I think the short answer is yes. Yes, it does make it harder to balance those. But I think that kind of speaks to, one of the high-level goals of Shadowlands and class design, like we've said, is we really want to try to keep it focused on the class. So when we were discussing these Covenant abilities, we wanted to make sure it worked for the whole class, no matter if they have different roles or different, different specs that are doing different things. So as you're seeing, what that has kind of presented itself as is a lot of these hybrid type Covenant abilities are doing both damage and healing. We haven't really done like a deep dive in terms of how we're going to be tuning that yet, so I don't have a great answer for you there. But I am actually curious of those, hybrid like abilities, like you're looking at the Druid today. Which one of those do you think are working for you? Like, which ones do you think are really cool? Like, did you like the Vesper Totem or the Monk Weapons of Order, or are there things that are not working as well for you there?
Well, with the danger of sounding rude, and I don't want to do that, it really depends on whether the ability itself is fun to press, regardless of what it does. So if we look at Vesper Totem is really nice, because the great thing about Shamans is their immense utility, certainly in a 5-man dungeon environment. They can do so much. And then when you throw down a Vesper Totem, which was really well designed so that you have 3 charges of DPS and you have 3 charges of healing, you don't have to choose either or, it kind of motivates you once you drop a Vesper Totem to do some healing, because you can put out this burst healing on the group. And sometimes you are using that ability in different ways. Sometimes you're just going into an AoE pack, you're going to throw down Vesper Totem, it's going to pulse and do damage. Sometimes you're thinking, this pack's tough, I'm going to hold my Vesper Totem so I could do damage with it and throw out healing. And you're thinking that way as a healer from the opposite. I want to throw out my healing, but I'm going to put damage out there because it's also going to proc with Vesper Totem. If I look at, say, the Kyrian Kindred Spirits, I couldn't care less about that ability because I don't really know, I don't feel it in any way, shape, or form. And that's where the difference lies for me, is it feels, and this is why we wanted to ask this question, is with a Druid covering 4 different roles, is it seems like that has really hampered their ability to have a good Covenant ability, because it has to work for a tank, it has to work for a healer, it has to work for a ranged DPS, and it has to work with a melee. So what we've ended up with seemingly is Kindred Spirits, which is neither here nor there. And also we have I forget the name of it, but the Revendreth ability, which is also just lined up with cooldowns, essentially, because it makes your damage go higher. So you line it up with Celestial Alignment, you're going to line it up with Berserk, and it's fire and forget. And that's kind of the issue we wanted to tackle here is, are you feeling very limited because they have to work for all these different roles?
Yeah, I mean, that, to your point, absolutely puts some additional design constraints on them. There are a lot of different designs we could go with. And like I've said a few times, part of, the goal of coming out and talking with the community and putting up feedback threads and getting it in your hands as quickly as possible is just getting this feedback, right? And it's awesome to hear what you're saying right now with, hey, this feels good because of these reasons, and this is not so good because of these other reasons. So, that's absolutely something that we can look at. And we know we want to take time to iterate on these Covenant abilities, where on the ones that we feel like aren't hitting the mark, as well as some other ones like Vesper Totem, like you might mention. So, I don't have here's the solution for you, but I think
come on.
that's on the spot.
Fix it. I made a thread. Oh, no, that's fine. Let's take a look at classes then, because I know we're kind of coming up against time here. I don't want Josh shouting at me.
Is he?
So we've got on the classes stuff. So when I announced that we are going to have this interview, I had thousands and thousands of questions submitted, and they were all about their class, their individual class, and we're not going to be able to do that. But there are definitely a couple I'd like to look at. There are a few classes that still, even after BFA, seem to be suffering from what we kind of coined Legion syndrome. Which is by the end of the expansion, so the end of Legion, the end of BFA, these classes are so good they're flavor of the month. And the greatest example I can think of right now is a Fire Mage. But they're so massively propped up. In Legion, it was with legendaries and their gear there. And in BFA, they're propped up by Corruption. They're propped up by Mechion Braces, Ashara Trinket, and Essences, which work super well with those. But similar to what we saw at the start of BFA is when you take all that end of expansion stuff away, they're almost fundamentally unworkable as a class. And their talent system, certainly for if we continue with Fire here, almost seems so locked in now for several years because, like the way you've changed Ignite to work now with Fire Blast, it feels almost like the class itself just doesn't work if we don't take Flame on. And similar with Arcane is there's just the talent tree feels pretty set because that's how Arcane works. I'm wondering, is something being looked at with classes like that, or is it a case of we know where these goes? Because we're coming back to that total package idea, aren't we? It's like, well, don't worry about it right now because pretty soon you're going to see the whole picture. Or is there something that's being done actively at the foundation of the spec there?
Man, that's a super easy question to answer. There's a lot in there. Okay. All right,
sorry.
No, you're good. I think it's a really good question. There's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
I'll try to start from the beginning, like you mentioned, and I'll try to touch on the mage aspect in a minute as well. So I think Legion syndrome, like as you called it, I think that's a really good piece of feedback, and I think it is absolutely something that is real and something that I think when you look at the end of Legion, that was an entire expansion's worth of systems where we had updates to we called it the constellation of your artifact in 7.2 into the Netherlight Crucible in 7.3, and there was just a lot of things that we had kind of developed over the course of Legion, and with BFA we replaced it with the Azerite system. I think it's fair to say that the Azerite system didn't really do a good enough job shoring up the gaps that all of the things that you had lost from Legion. So it did feel you felt that loss immediately, and I think that's something that we took to heart when we were looking to develop Shadowlands, and we really want to make sure that with things like the Covenant ability, the Covenant signature ability, Soulbinds, Conduits, we're bringing legendaries back. That's a lot of really cool stuff. There's a lot of meaty systems there to kind of sink your teeth into and play with over time. And we think, even though Battle for Azeroth had, its fair share of problems, and we had to, add essences in the middle, and then we added corruption now as well, we were kind of layering systems on top of each other. Where Battle for Azeroth, we took a more Shadowlands, we've taken a more holistic look and tried to ensure that, coming out the gates, there's enough there to kind of prop that up. So that's, I think, the first part of your question. And to the second part, Mages is a great example of someone that we've gotten this feedback on before. We absolutely are listening, and we're trying to make changes based on that. We gave Touch of the Magi baseline. There's some mana return on Arcane Barrage, but we recognize that there's likely more work to be done there. Like I said, right now our main goal is get as much of this stuff in as possible so that you guys have that full picture. And then, while we're working on the cool new stuff like these anima powers and conduits, you guys have a chance to look at some of the core class changes we made, and you can kind of compile the feedback there. And then once there's consensus and opportunity for people to sink their teeth into that, we can have the opportunity to then revisit some of those questions.
Okay, so just an ongoing process as the package.
Did I get through? Yeah, did I get through everything? I don't even remember. There's a lot to that question.
There is no way we can make everyone happy here. We both know it, but the questions are worthwhile, I think, after testing all the classes out.
Cool.
I have to ask, Shadow Priest, when do we find something out that's happening there? We know you guys are aware of it with the issues with Shadow Priest. These are the kind of big hitters I wanted to talk about. Is there anything you can update us with there?
I don't have any updates today. I'll go with soon TM.
Okay.
I know it's definitely on our radar. It's something that we're discussing. But like I said, game development is, just non-stop triage. There's so much stuff that we're excited to work on and do, and it's just a matter of okay, what are we working on now? What's next? So it's definitely something that's on our radar. But the goal, as I've mentioned many times, is just to try to get all these new Shadowlands systems kind of put together so you guys can see the whole package.
So we might see, just to alleviate people who obviously are waiting daily for stuff like that, is more class stuff. Once we've got the whole package, then we can start looking at the thing as what it's going to fully look like later down the testing process.
Yeah, because like we said, I mean, there's a lot that is involved in making your class feel really satisfying and fun to play. And not only just the core class stuff, but like you mentioned, there's essences, there's itemization, right? Maybe there's some items in the raid that are going to make a large impact on how you play your class. And we want to make sure that we're making these changes with that full picture in mind.
Okay. Thank you for that. Okay, the final question, I can see the time as we're here now, but the last question I would like to bring up here is, although Ted did ask Ian about this, one thing that wasn't brought up during that is the unpruning and the addition of new spells has made the GCD change a lot more prominent than it even was in BFA. In some cases where, like Enhancement Shaman and Arcane Mages, with the amount of stuff they need to set up to get going, it's taking an extremely long time. I know Ian said, it's going to case-by-case basis. So what is the best way of us dealing with that, and how is that conversation going on internally?
You saved all the easy questions for last, huh?
I didn't know I'd get to ask you about covenants and classes, so it really went hardcore. Sorry.
No.
Now you know what I want the 24 hours.
You're good. These are really good questions. It's important that we try to address as much of this as possible. So, okay, yeah, like you mentioned, Ted and Ian have discussed this a bit. Ian kind of asked for examples of, hey, can you tell me about which buttons still feel bad to be on the GCD? To the point that you were making, it sounds like you had a more specific point of I'm pushing all these buttons back to back to back to get my DPS rotation going. I think we all agree that that's a problem, right? Like, there's no world in which we put these buttons back on the GCD, and the correct answer is, well, now I'm just going to take 6 seconds to push these 4 buttons, and then I can start DPSing. Like, that doesn't feel good. I think we agree that's a problem. Where we maybe disagree is I don't think the answer to that problem is just pull them back off the GCD, right? Like, I think there's got to be a potential design solution there, or maybe there's some buttons, like you mentioned, that we should have left pruned or maybe not made baseline. Like, we certainly shouldn't be making...
No, you don't put that on me.
No, blame him.
Preach says prune.
Yes, exactly. Preach says prune that again. So, we shouldn't be making that problem worse. Like, maybe, to use a specific example, since we're just talking about mages, mirror images as a DPS button. If the answer there is, well, I'm just going to put this in that line of things I need to push, maybe that shouldn't come back, or we leave it as a talent where it currently was. I think we speak again. I'll talk to the community for a moment here, I would love to see, what are the worst case situations? Like, where are the really bad outliers where it's like, yeah, I have 4 buttons I push. I think that's an area where we should at least start looking and start there. And then we can try to look at the problem as a whole and get through all of the problems. But there are likely outliers that are far worse than others. And I think that's important to identify which ones really have reached that point where it's like, yeah, I've got 2 buttons of like, no, this guy's got like 4 or 5. That seems more extreme. But I think we have more work to do there, right? We made a couple of changes during Battle for Azeroth. We made some design changes to Restoration Ascendance that I think felt really good. We added some immediate healing, and it felt really impactful when you push that button. And then maybe it didn't become the right design to push multiple cooldowns back to back in all cases. So that kind of helps to solve that problem. And I think there's certainly more work we can do there, and we can use the community's help in identifying kind of the worst outliers.
Yeah, just to quell the storm that's likely to come from this little bit is that we're not against the idea, because like mirror images, as an example, is one of the global cooldowns that's annoying to press during the ramp up. But mirror images is awesome. It really fits in with the class fantasy. It has a DPS role. It has a tanking role. It's such a cool button to press that we don't want to lose it either. So the door isn't closed to say, okay, a few of these spells need to come off the GCD. We know if the community is pushing very hard to say they love this ability, but it's annoying where it fits into how I play. That it can,
right, and that's what I mean by like potentially even change designs of it, right? Like mirror images, like if you think about the fantasy of mirror images, that acting as almost more of a survivability or utility button, like you could totally see a world where it fits into that role versus, well, I'm going to push this right as the same time I push arcane power, right? Like there's lots of design space there. That is a potential solution, right? I'm not saying that's what we're going to do, just more like this is a complicated problem and we know we've got more work to do. And it is a bit of a case by case in terms of, okay, what about this one? Does this still fit here? Does it need to be redesigned? Maybe it doesn't.
Yeah, oh, that's understandable. Well, I'd like to thank you for your time, Morgan. That was amazing. I truly enjoyed it. I hope we didn't scare you.
No, man, it's awesome. I love that, and we should do this again sometime.
I would really hope so. Yeah, it's if we can ever get together to further down the line, because we still have several months, of course, before Shadowlands comes out live. I would really love to spend some more time with you to talk about these things, and hopefully we'll get to meet in person whenever we can actually do that again at some point in the world.
When I'm allowed to leave my house.
Yeah, same. Luckily, I'm still working. It didn't hit me that hard, thankfully. Thank you very much for your time from all of us here. I think everyone really... I think people like that. I didn't actually have the chat open during this, but I'm hoping they enjoyed it. Sure. So thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, and honestly, man, thank you. As an influencer, as a contributor, as someone who's just loves to play WoW. You guys are the reason we do this. Like, I love WoW. It's been a passion for a long time, and just seeing you guys kind of engage with it and enjoy it, and the discussion that happens. It's so important to us to hear that. And that you guys feel involved in this process is a huge goal of ours, like you've been talking about. So thank you guys for everything you do. Thanks to the community for all of the amazing feedback and things that you've been passing along to us. You're the reason we do this. So thank you.
No, thank you. And thank you for, this is going to sound lame, but honestly, as somebody who really did not enjoy my time in BFA that much, Shadowlands has been everything I could have hoped you guys were making. And I genuinely mean that.
Awesome.
Like playing alpha, so much more fun than playing live for me. So I'm a very happy boy. Thank you very much again, Morgan. And I really do hope we get to talk again. I'm going to move us to the background to say an actual goodbye. But thank you again.
Cool. Bye, chat.